Right now, as you are watching this, the Amazon rainforest is burning again. Fires are flickering along the southern edge of the basin in Rondônia and Mato Grosso. Satellites detected forest clearing across 1,295 square kilometers of the Brazilian Amazon in just the first 6 months of this year, according to Brazil's National Space Agency, INPE. NOAA is watching the Pacific Ocean warm toward what forecasters are already calling a super El Niño, one expected to hit its peak in the second half of 2026. And Brazil's Environment Ministry has quietly raised the national firefighting budget by 20% this year, because the government believes what is coming next could be worse than what we have already seen. This is not normal news cycle noise. Something significant is happening across the world's largest rainforest, and it is happening at the exact moment the climate system is loading up for a punch nobody has forgotten from 2024. Today, we are going to break down exactly what is going on inside the Amazon right now, where the fires are most likely to hit next, and whether the worst really could still be ahead. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever personally seen wildfire smoke roll into your town, the sky turning orange in the middle of the day, the smell in the air for days? Tell me where you were and what it felt like. If you want to be the first to know every time something major happens on this planet, subscribe. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one, so the algorithm actually shows it to people who need to see it. Now, let us get into it. To understand what makes the current situation dangerous, we have to go back to what happened less than 2 years ago. On the afternoon of September 9th, 2024, the sky over Sao Paulo, a city of more than 12 million people, turned a color the city had never seen before. It was 2 in the afternoon. The sun disappeared behind a wall of smoke that had traveled more than 2,000 kilometers from fires burning in the Amazon and the Cerrado savanna to the north. Drivers turned on their headlights. Streetlights came on. Traffic lights struggled to be seen through the haze. And a city of 12 million people watched the day go dark. That was not the start of the disaster. That was the middle of it. By the time the 2024 fire season had ended, 44.2 million acres of the Brazilian Amazon had burned. To put 44.2 million acres in context, that is larger than the entire state of California. It was a 66% jump from the previous year. And the previous year, 2023, had itself been 35% worse than the year before. The line on the chart was not just going up, it was accelerating. The fires did not stay inside Brazil. In Bolivia, more than 2.47 million acres of forest burned, an increase of nearly 114% above the previous record, which was set in 2019. Peru had its worst fire season ever recorded, and most of the destruction happened inside primary, old-growth forest, the kind that does not grow back inside a human lifetime. Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Guyana all reported major surges in the same weeks. It was a continental event, and by the peak of the season, satellites were counting more active fire pixels across the Amazon basin than at any point since monitoring began. The science on why 2024 was so bad is clear. That year, the Amazon experienced a historic drought for the second year in a row. The soil dried out. The rivers dropped. Some of the largest tributaries, including the Solomos, the Rio Negro, and the Madeira, fell to the lowest levels ever recorded at multiple gauge stations. In some communities on the Rio Negro, families who had lived on the water their entire lives watched the shoreline retreat hundreds of meters. Ferries stopped running. Deliveries of food, fuel, and medicine had to be brought in by small boat or by air. The understory, that low layer of plants growing between the forest floor and the canopy, went from being a humid firebreak to being kindling. And into that dry forest went the ignition source that almost always starts these fires in the first place: human beings. Ranchers, land grabbers, and illegal miners set fires to clear land for cattle, for soy, and for road access. The unprecedented drought did not create the fires. It just let a normal amount of human ignition become an abnormal amount of destruction. Then something surprising happened in 2025. The fires largely stopped. According to Map Biomas, the independent Brazilian monitoring platform, 3.1 million hectares burned in 2025, an area of about 7.7 million acres. That was the smallest area burned in the entire Amazon since satellite records began in 1985. Aine Alencar, science director at the Amazon Environmental Research Institute, described the drop as out of the ordinary. A delayed rainy season blocked what she called the ideal window for burning. Deforestation eased at the same time, which drastically reduced the amount of dry fuel lying on the ground. And communities across the basin, terrified by what they had watched happen in 2024, actively suppressed small outbreaks before they could become large ones. There was also a psychological factor, as Alencar put it, a shared memory across the basin of what an out-of-control fire season looks like when it arrives. That memory changed behavior on the ground. The first half of 2026 has continued that better trend. Between January and June, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon fell to 1,295 square kilometers, down 38% from the same 6 months of 2025. That is the lowest 10-year figure for the period. Marina Silva, the environment minister, has said publicly that if current efforts continue, Brazil could hit the lowest annual Amazon deforestation rate since record-keeping began in 1988. The government's 12-month PRODES total, which closed the year ending July 2025, came in at 5,796 square kilometers, down 11%, the lowest in 11 years. On paper, this looks like recovery. But here's the part nobody talks about on the Good News Day. Even inside those lower deforestation numbers, one deeply uncomfortable statistic keeps showing up. Mangabe's coverage of recent monitoring found that more than half, 51%, of newly detected deforestation was happening inside areas that had already been burned. That is a record. Criminals are letting the fire do the work first, then moving in to clear what remains. Fire has become a cheaper, less risky illegal chainsaw. And it means the forest that survived 2024 is now more flammable than it was before, because a burned Amazon burns hotter and faster the second time. There is one more warning sign hidden inside the 2026 numbers. Independent monitoring by the Amazon Institute recorded that even as the size of cleared areas fell, the number of wildfires in the region climbed by more than 30% through the early months of the year. Fewer big clearings, but more individual fires. That is not a contradiction. It is a pattern change. And it is exactly the pattern you would expect if criminal actors are shifting to smaller, more distributed ignition points that are harder to detect from space until they have already merged into something bigger. That changed fast. To put the danger in real terms, we need to understand two things. The first is what an El Niño does to the Amazon. The second is what a dry understory does to a forest that has already been damaged. An El Niño is a warming of the sea surface across the central and eastern Pacific Ocean. It shows up roughly every 2 to 7 years. When it happens, the atmosphere reorganizes itself in a way that pulls rainfall away from South America and dumps it elsewhere on the planet. Meteorologists describe this in terms of something called the Walker circulation, the normal east-to-west movement of air across the tropical Pacific. During an El Niño, that circulation weakens or even reverses. The result, for the Amazon, is a longer dry season, hotter afternoons, and lower river levels. When climate change is added on top, the warmed baseline stacks with the El Niño peak, and you can end up with the conditions scientists saw in 2023 and 2024, when parts of the Amazon reached the driest state in more than a century. A super El Niño is a stronger event, defined by NOAA using thresholds on a metric called the Oceanic Niño Index. It is measured as a temperature anomaly averaged over a specific box of the equatorial Pacific. When that anomaly stays above 2 degrees Celsius for months at a time, forecasters begin to use the word super. Not every warm event becomes a super event, but when it does, the effect on the Amazon has been documented before. Less rain, more heat, and a longer window in which a small illegal fire can escape into the surrounding forest. To put that in context, the difference between a normal year and an El Niño year is not luck, it is physics. And the physics of an ocean warmer than average is that it rearranges the position of the jet stream and the location of the tropical rain belt, which is exactly what an Amazon fire wants. The second piece of the puzzle is the forest itself. A healthy Amazon rainforest is one of the wettest places on Earth. Water condenses on the leaves, drips down to the understory, and keeps the low layer of the forest humid enough that a match dropped inside it would go out. The trees themselves participate in this system. Through a process scientists call evapotranspiration, mature Amazon trees pump billions of gallons of water into the atmosphere every day, feeding the very rain clouds that keep the ecosystem wet. It is a self-sustaining loop, and it is one of the reasons the Amazon has stayed a rainforest for tens of millions of years. But once a section of forest has been degraded, once the canopy has been thinned out by a previous fire, or by selective logging, or by fragmentation from road building, the water cycle breaks. Sunlight reaches the floor. The understory dries. Evapotranspiration drops locally. And now the same match starts a fire that can run for miles. This is why scientists are careful to separate two words that sound similar: deforestation and degradation. Deforestation is when the forest is fully cleared, usually with satellite proof. Degradation is when the forest is still there but broken from the inside by fire, logging, and drought. Recent research tracked by map biomas and by researchers at institutions across Brazil and Europe has found that degradation can now release amounts of carbon comparable to or exceeding deforestation itself. The forest is still standing on the map. It is just leaking. And that leak matters far beyond South America. The Amazon has historically absorbed a huge fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions humanity produces. When large sections of it flip from being a carbon sink to being a carbon source, the entire global temperature line moves. Scientists studying this concept, sometimes called the tipping point, generally do not conclude that the whole basin will flip overnight. But the boundary of the vulnerable zone has been moving south and east each year, and 2024 pushed it further than any single year on record. Now, let us talk about the human stakes, because the numbers by themselves do not carry the weight of what actually happens on the ground. Consider a firefighter named Antonio. He has spent the last 7 years running toward fires that most people run from. He works inside the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve, one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, named after the Brazilian activist who was killed defending it in 1988. In an interview published earlier this year, Antonio described 2024 as the most extreme fire year of his career. He said, in his own words, that he had never seen anything like it, that the forest burned like dry pasture, and that it was frightening even for the men who risked their lives to protect it. Antonio's account is the human version of the satellite data. When a forest that has been kept humid for thousands of years burns like dry grass, something has gone deeply wrong with the underlying condition of the ecosystem. And the people fighting that fire, mostly poorly paid state contractors, indigenous fire brigades, and reserve rangers, are being asked to hold a line that the climate has moved on them. Many of them have been on the front line for a decade or longer. They know exactly which valleys catch fire first, which access roads flood in the wet season, and which ridgelines will let a fire jump for miles. That local knowledge is one of the few real advantages Brazil still has going into this year. The contrast between 2024 and 2025 is exactly the kind of comparison that makes this story clear. In 2024, the Amazon burned the largest area since map biomas records began in 1985. In 2025, it burned the smallest. The difference between those two outcomes was not policy alone. It was weather. Specifically, it was a delayed and generous rainy season that never showed up in 2024 and did show up in 2025. If the weather in 2026 refuses to cooperate, the trend line will flip again, and the same criminal actors who profited in 2024 are still out there waiting. There are also communities most people watching this video have never heard of. The Yanomami, the Munduruku, the Kayapo, and dozens of other indigenous groups live directly downwind of these fires. When a bad fire year hits, respiratory hospitalizations spike across cities as far south as Porto Velho and Rio Branco. In a bad week, pediatric wards fill with children whose asthma has been triggered by particulate matter drifting hundreds of kilometers from the fire fronts. Elderly people and children with existing lung conditions are the first to be admitted. When the smoke reaches Sao Paulo, as it did in September 2024, it stops being a rainforest story and starts being a public health story for tens of millions of people. Air quality index readings that would trigger emergency alerts in Los Angeles or Denver became the norm across large parts of Brazil for weeks. And the difference between a country that is ready and a country that is not ready is not luck. It is preparation. Brazil has, this year, added 20% to its national firefighting budget, deployed additional aircraft, and prepositioned ground crews in the states of Rondônia, Para, Mato Grosso, and Amazonas. Command posts that used to spin up in September have been staffed since May. Whether that investment is enough to hold the line against a super El Niño is the exact question everyone at INPE and everyone at the Environment Ministry is asking right now. But here is the problem that keeps scientists up at night. Even with better firefighting, and even with lower deforestation, the forest that is still standing is more vulnerable than it was 5 years ago. And the ignition sources have not gone away. The criminal networks that clear land illegally in the Amazon are organized, well-financed, and have adapted to enforcement. When enforcement rises in one state, they move to another. When satellite monitoring gets sharper, they set smaller fires spread across a wider area. Some networks have started working at night specifically to avoid the daytime satellite passes. Others have started using drones for their own scouting. This is not a small-time operation, and it is not a fair fight. Now, let us talk about what scientists are actually watching for in the second half of 2026, because the alarms are not being pulled at random. The first signal is the Oceanic Niño Index, the number NOAA publishes to describe how warm the tropical Pacific is. As of the most recent updates, the Pacific is trending warm, and forecasters are watching for a threshold that would classify the event as strong or super. Modeling ensembles from the United States, Europe, Japan, and Australia are all being run against the same underlying ocean data, and when several of those models converge on the same outcome, confidence in the forecast rises. That convergence is what forecasters are watching for right now. That is signal one. The second signal is river levels. INPE and Brazilian universities monitor river gauges across the basin. In a bad drought year, rivers like the Solomos, the Rio Negro, and the Madeira drop to historic lows. In late 2023, some of these gauges hit their lowest levels ever recorded, and in 2024, several of those records were broken again. If the same collapse begins to appear in the second half of 2026, that is a leading indicator that the surrounding forest is drying out fast enough to burn. Communities living along the rivers are often the first to see it, weeks before the graphs show it. When the ferry to a village is canceled for the third week in a row, that is a data point. The third signal is heat. Not just average temperature, but consecutive days above 35 degrees Celsius, which is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, in areas where that used to be rare. When a rainforest region strings together multiple weeks of that kind of heat, the moisture content of the understory falls below what firefighters call the critical threshold. Once it falls below that threshold, small fires stop self-extinguishing and start propagating. Local weather stations across the basin are already reporting temperatures in that range earlier in the year than usual, and forecasters are watching to see whether those readings become a sustained run rather than a passing spike. The fourth signal is the pattern that came out of the 2025 monitoring data, the 51% of new deforestation happening inside already burned land. If that percentage climbs further in the second half of this year, it means criminal networks are exploiting the degraded forest as a shortcut, and the total damage to the ecosystem will exceed what the deforestation number alone shows. Keep an eye on cattle prices, too. When the price of beef in Brazil rises fast, land clearing activity historically rises with it, because pasture becomes more profitable. Global export demand, especially from Asia, moves the same lever. It is not the story cable news tells about the Amazon, but it is one of the most reliable early warnings that fire activity is coming. To put all of these signals together, the worst realistic outcome for 2026 is not the Amazon going up in a single continent-wide inferno. That is not how this ecosystem burns, and scientists generally do not conclude that it will. The realistic worst case is more familiar. It is a repeat of 2024 or worse. A second consecutive dry year, driven by a strong El Niño, meeting a forest that has already been damaged, that has 51% of its recent deforestation happening on burn scars, and that is being ignited by the same organized criminal networks that were never fully dismantled. If that combination lines up in September and October of this year, the response window will be very short. And that is exactly why the Environment Ministry is spending money in July that historically would have been spent in December. So let us bring this back to what you actually need to know. The Amazon is not about to disappear in the next 6 months. Despite dramatic online headlines, there is currently no scientific evidence that the entire rainforest will collapse this year, or that a supervolcano of ecological destruction is imminent across the whole basin. That is not what serious scientists studying this system are saying, and it is not what the satellite data shows. Deforestation, for the first half of 2026, is genuinely at a 10-year low, and there are real, measurable reasons for that. Enforcement is up, investment is up, public attention is up. And an entire generation of Brazilian firefighters, scientists, and journalists have spent the last 2 years building the systems that could stop the next disaster before it starts. But the most realistic danger is not decades away, and it is not thousands of miles away either. It is what happens during the next few months, in a forest that has already been thinned out from the inside, meeting a Pacific Ocean that is warming toward a super El Niño peak, meeting the same criminal ignition sources that were never removed from the equation. That combination could produce another catastrophic fire season starting as early as August, and the smoke from it would not stay inside South America. It would travel, as it did in 2024, north and south for thousands of kilometers. It would darken skies in cities that have never thought of themselves as fire cities. It would fill hospital wards. And it would put another year of pressure on the boundary of that vulnerable zone. That is the real threat, not an apocalypse, a repeat. And the response window between the first signals and the first uncontrollable fire front is a matter of weeks, not months. So, before you go, if this breakdown made the situation clearer for you, hit that thumbs up. We are trying to get to 5,000 likes on this one, so YouTube actually shows it to the people who need to see it. And drop that comment. Tell me where you were the first time you saw wildfire smoke change the color of your sky. I read them all. Let us go. See you in the next one.